The thread snapped. Not the wool she had been working between her fingers for the last hour, but something deeper, something that had been pulled taut inside Maude Norris's chest for the past 3 years, something that finally, irreversibly, gave way in the moment she spread the woven map across the surface of Sheriff Aldous Crane's desk and watched the color drain from his face like water through cracked earth. "You want to tell me what this is?" she said, her voice low and controlled, the kind of voice that had learned to stay quiet through every dismissal, every snicker, every turned back in the town of Harrow Creek. The sheriff did not answer right away. He looked at the textile she had placed before him, a complex piece of weaving roughly the size of a saddle blanket, dense with color and pattern, and his jaw worked silently like a man trying to swallow something that refused to go down. "It's a blanket," he finally said. "It's a map," Maude said. "And it's a ledger, and it's a confession." Behind her, she heard boots on the wooden floor of the sheriff's office. She did not need to turn around. She had heard those boots before, crossing hardwood and dirt, crossing the distance between anger and something far more dangerous than anger. She had cataloged the sound in the back of her mind the way she cataloged everything, the way she turned observation into pattern and pattern into meaning. "Crane." Jonas Calloway's voice filled the room. "Step away from the desk." The sheriff's hand had moved toward the lower drawer and it stopped. Maude turned then, and she saw Jonas standing in the doorway of the sheriff's office, his broad shoulders blocking most of the early November light, his dark eyes moving from her to Crane and back again, with an expression she had never quite seen on him before. It was not the hard certainty she had grown accustomed to in the weeks since he had started paying attention to her. It was something that looked almost like awe, pulled thin and tight across the bones of his face. "She figured it out," Jonas said, and it was not a question. "Every thread of it," Maude answered. And in the silence that followed, as Sheriff Aldous Crane sat back in his chair with the particular stillness of a man who understood that every exit had just been sewn shut around him, the whole of the story that had brought them to this moment began to unspool like yarn from a dropped spool, rolling back and back across the dusty floor of the past. Harrow Creek sat in the eastern stretch of Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1882, the kind of town that had grown too fast and too crooked, the way a young tree will grow toward bad light and come out bent. It had a general store, a saloon called the Lucky Plow, a land office, a church nobody used much, a schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall, and a water mill that ground wheat for 3 counties. It had a sheriff appointed by the county seat and a mayor who was the sheriff's brother-in-law, and it had about 400 souls who mostly minded their own business, because minding other people's business in Harrow Creek had a way of turning costly. Maude Norris had come to Harrow Creek in the spring of 1879, when she was 24 years old and recently widowed, carrying everything she owned in a canvas bag and a cedar chest, which included 300 pounds of raw wool, a pair of Scandinavian floor looms, a box of dyes made from plants she had learned to identify from a Shoshone woman named Amma who had lived near her previous home in northern Utah, and a brain that never stopped working even when the rest of her was exhausted. She had taken the small building at the end of Birch Street, which had briefly been a barber's shop, and before that some kind of storage for mining equipment, and she had paid 3 months' rent in advance with money she had earned selling blankets during the train journey through Salt Lake City. She set up her looms by the window to catch the western light, hung bundles of dye plants from the ceiling beams, stacked her raw fleece in the dry back room, and opened her door to the public. The public was not particularly interested. Harrow Creek had no shortage of practical goods. The general store carried factory-woven cloth from the East, cheaper than anything Maude could produce, and most of the ranching families who might have valued quality woolens were either too proud to admit they needed them or too suspicious of a young widow operating a business alone to darken her doorway. The women of the town were polite to her face and puzzled behind her back. The men who came in did so on some errand or another and left quickly, unnerved perhaps, by the steady movement of her hands at the loom, by the way she could hold a conversation and never lose count of her pattern, by the particular intelligence in her eyes that seemed to register everything and forget nothing. She survived. That was the honest accounting of her first 2 years in Harrow Creek. She sold enough to pay her rent, to buy wool from ranchers who were glad enough to sell her the fiber even if they would not buy it back in finished form, to eat simply and sleep soundly and continue the work that had always been more than a livelihood to her. Because weaving, for Maude Norris, was a language. She had understood this since childhood, sitting at her grandmother's knee in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania, watching the old woman's fingers move through the warped threads with a certainty and grace that felt like fluency. Her grandmother had taught her that every weave structure told a story in its interlacing, that twill carried weight differently than plain weave, that a double weave could hold a secret inside itself, a hidden layer that only revealed its meaning when the cloth was cut apart or turned exactly right in the light. Maude had taken that teaching seriously in a way her grandmother had perhaps not fully anticipated. She had taught herself to read and make woven textiles the way a surveyor reads land, the way a cartographer encodes geography into symbol and line. She had learned, through years of practice and an obsessive attention to the relationship between structure and information, how to embed data inside a woven piece in a way that was invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking for. Numbers could live in a threading sequence. Names could be carried in a color progression. Boundaries and distances could be expressed in the proportion of sections. A woven map, made by someone who understood both weaving and the land being mapped, was a document as precise and irrefutable as any surveyor's plat, and considerably harder to destroy by fire or flood or the deliberate hand of a man with something to hide. The land fraud had begun, as far as Maude could later reconstruct, in the summer of 1880. It had begun quietly, the way the worst betrayals always begin, not with a thunderclap but with a slow and unremarkable shifting of things, the way ground subsides before it collapses entirely. The land office in Harrow Creek was run by a man named Ellsworth Boone, a thin, precise individual with careful hands, and a habit of wearing a coat slightly too formal for a frontier town, as though he were always about to give testimony somewhere and wanted to look prepared. Boone was efficient and helpful and universally regarded as a straight dealer, and this reputation was one of his most carefully tended assets. What Boone had been doing, with the knowledge and cooperation of Sheriff Aldous Crane and the financial backing of a cattle syndicate operating out of Cheyenne, was simple in concept and complicated in execution. He had been issuing fraudulent certificates of land title to the syndicate for parcels that were already settled by homesteaders under the Homestead Act of 1862, backdating the syndicate documents to predate the legitimate claims, and then using the sheriff to pressure, threaten, or in a few cases simply remove the homesteaders who stood in the way. The syndicate men called it land consolidation. The homesteaders who found themselves evicted with no legal recourse and nowhere to appeal called it something considerably less polished. Maude had become aware that something was wrong not because anyone confided in her or because she had gone looking for trouble, but because her work required her to know the land. She dyed her own yarn, which meant she foraged for dyestuffs, which meant she spent considerable time walking the countryside within a day's ride of Harrow Creek at different seasons, cataloging what grew where. And in the course of that walking, she had begun to notice discrepancies. Fields that had been planted the previous spring standing untended and bare by autumn, with no sign of harvest or abandonment, just sudden vacancy. Fence lines that had been in one place in the summer standing in a different place by the following year. A family she had seen regularly at the general store, the Prentice family, 3 children and a capable mother named Dora, simply not there anymore, their claim on the South Creek bend empty and quiet. She had asked around carefully, the way she did everything, without drawing attention to herself, weaving questions into ordinary conversation the way she wove color into cloth, and the answers she received were individually unremarkable and collectively alarming. People had left. Families had moved on. The land out south was being consolidated for cattle grazing. It was economic progress. It was the way of things. Nobody seemed troubled. Or rather, people seemed troubled in the private, swallowed way of communities that have collectively decided not to look directly at a thing because looking at it directly might require action. Maude looked at it directly. She began systematically documenting what she observed on her Diplant walks, not in a notebook, which could be found and read, but in the textiles she was already producing. Each piece she wove during the year and a half of her investigation contained embedded data, locations, dates, the names of families she had spoken with discreetly, the direction and approximate distance of disputed boundaries. She used a notation system she had developed herself, building on the principle of her grandmother's double weave, where two separate cloth layers were woven simultaneously, and one could contain information invisible to anyone examining only the surface. She spoke to the families who had been displaced, traveling in the guise of looking for wool or diplants, sitting with women over tea, and listening with the particular quality of attention she had been told her whole life was unsettling. She visited the county recorder's office in Milford under the pretense of checking the status of her own business property and spent 2 hours at a public records table, taking in every detail she could hold in her extraordinary memory and checking it against what she had been told by the displaced families. She found the discrepancies. The dates did not align. The syndicate land certificates, when she compared them carefully against the homestead claim dates she had memorized, were fraudulent. The land had been given away twice, and the second transaction had been dressed up to look like the first. The problem was evidence. Her observations were her own. Her memory was her own. Her embedded woven records were precise and detailed, but they were encoded in a system only she fully understood, and she knew that walking into any legal proceeding with a blanket and explaining that it constituted documentary evidence would result in being dismissed before she finished her first sentence. The frontier, in 1881 and 1882, was not a place that extended much patience to a woman with unorthodox methods, regardless of the quality of her mind. And then Jonas Calloway rode into Harrow Creek. He arrived in early September of 1882, which was 2 weeks before the moment in Sheriff Crane's office, and his arrival was the kind that drew eyes, not because he was making an effort to be noticed, but simply because he was the kind of man whose presence registered physically in a room or a street, the way a change in weather registers before you can name it. He was 30 years old, though he looked older in the way that men do who have spent years in open country under hard sun, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that seemed to have been cut from the same limestone that formed the creek bluffs. He was tall without being lanky, broad without being bulky, the particular build of someone who had worked hard all his life at things that required both strength and precision. He rode a blood bay horse named Soot that moved like something expensive even when she was just walking, and he wore his gun low and comfortable in the way of a man who had used it before and preferred not to have to use it again. He had come to Harrow Creek, Maude would learn later, because of his own dark past with the syndicate. Jonas Calloway had grown up on a small ranch in the Nebraska Panhandle, the son of a man named George Calloway who had homesteaded the land in 1868 and spent 14 years building it into something worth having. In the spring of 1881, George Calloway had received a visit from 2 men he did not recognize, who informed him that his land had been reassigned under a prior territorial claim and that he had 60 days to vacate. George Calloway, who was 61 years old, stubborn as bedrock, and in possession of his own land certificate, had refused. By July of that year, George Calloway was dead of what the county report called a riding accident, and the ranch had been occupied by men working for the Cheyenne Syndicate before the summer was out. Jonas had been working cattle drives at the time of his father's death. He had come home to an occupied property, a sealed county investigation that went nowhere, and a quiet certainty, the kind that settles into a man and does not leave, that his father had been murdered for his land. He had spent the following year following the trail of the syndicate's operations, quietly, methodically, the way he had learned to track animals across hard ground, looking for the pattern underneath the disturbance. The trail had led him, through a series of connections he had painstakingly assembled, to Ellsworth Boone and the Harrow Creek land office. He rode into town meaning to find evidence and stay no longer than necessary, because he was a man who had learned that staying in one place was a luxury he had not been able to afford since his father's death. He had not planned on Maude Norris. Their first meeting was without ceremony. He came into her shop because the wind off the November approaching plains had a bite to it that morning, and her was the only establishment on Birch Street with a lamp burning, and he was cold and wanted to think somewhere that was not the saloon. He opened the door, stepped inside, and found her at the larger of her two looms, working with a focus so complete she did not immediately look up, and he stood for a moment in the doorway with cold air coming in behind him and watched her hands. He had never seen anyone work at anything the way she worked at that loom. Her fingers moved through the warped threads with a speed and certainty that seemed almost mechanical, but the intelligence behind it was unmistakably human. The tiny adjustments, the slight tilt of her head as she checked the fell line, the completely unself-conscious way she was clearly thinking about something entirely separate from the physical motion of her hands, working on two problems simultaneously without either suffering for the other. She was humming something low and tuneless. "Shut the door," she said without looking up, "or sit down and shut it behind you. Either way." He shut the door and sat down on the bench she had near the window, the bench she kept for customers, though customers were rare enough that she had started using it for extra storage and had to move 2 bundles of undyed fleece to make room for himself. She finished her shuttle pass, checked her selvage, and looked up. Her eyes were a clear, unusual amber color, the color of creek water over sandstone, and they assessed him with a directness that was not unfriendly but was entirely unsentimental. "You're the man who rode in yesterday," she said. "Jonas Calloway, Maude Norris." She did not stop to explain what she did or make any attempt at commercial persuasion. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, with an attention that seemed to measure and file. "You're not here to buy anything." "No," he agreed. "Is that a problem?" "I get enough of that," she said. "What are you looking for in Harrow Creek?" It was a direct question, and she had asked it with a simplicity that cut through the preamble he had been unconsciously preparing, and he found himself answering more honestly than he had intended. "Land records," he said. "A trail that might start at your land office." She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment he saw something shift in her expression, the way terrain shifts when you are close enough to see it, something careful and calculating, and underneath that something that might have been relief. "How long have you been on that trail?" she asked. "About a year." She nodded once slowly, and then she did something he had not expected. She rose from her weaving bench, went to the back room, and returned carrying a woven piece folded flat, roughly the size of a large quilt, which she set on the worktable between them and began to unfold. He rose and came to look at it. And the longer he looked at it, the more he felt the particular disorientation of a man who had just walked into a room he thought he knew and found unexpected depth in every direction. It was not immediately obvious what he was looking at. At first glance it appeared to be a complex geometric textile, rich in color, densely woven, with repeating motifs that suggested both decorative intention and some underlying structural logic. But as he looked, with the patient attention he had trained himself to apply to everything that might contain a hidden message, he began to see it. The proportions were not decorative. They were cartographic. The repeating motifs were not simply repeating, they were sequencing, and the sections of alternating color he had initially read as pattern were spatial divisions. "Is this a map?" he said. "Among other things," Maude said. She was watching him with her arms crossed, her weight on one hip, in the posture of someone who has been waiting a long time for someone else to catch up. "What else is it?" "It's a record of land transactions in the South and East Creek districts going back to 1879, cross-referenced against the homestead dates I was able to verify through public records. The color coding in the border structure encodes the certificate dates from the land office. The directional pattern in the center field marks the locations of 9 separate properties whose current titles I believe to be fraudulent." She paused. "I've been working on it for 14 months. Jonas Calloway stared at her. He had tracked criminals across 3 states. He had worked with Pinkerton men who were paid handsomely for investigative work of considerably less complexity. He had ridden into this town expecting to be the one doing the figuring, the one carrying the thread of truth in a landscape of deliberate confusion. And he was looking at a woman who had independently, methodically, and in perfect secrecy, woven the entire case he had come here to build. The shock on his face was genuine and unconcealed, and she saw it clearly. "You didn't expect that," she said. "No," he admitted, "I did not." "Nobody does," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, just the frank acknowledgement of long experience. "Sit down, I'll explain the notation system." He sat down. She explained it. It took 2 hours, and by the end of those 2 hours Jonas Calloway was looking at Maude Norris with an expression she had not yet learned to read, because no one had ever looked at her quite that way before. A look that was admiration and something more vulnerable than admiration. A look that seemed to be recalibrating, the way a compass needle settles after it finds true north. "This is enough," he said. "If we can corroborate the embedded data against a reliable external source, this is enough to bring charges." "I know," she said. "I've known for 3 months. The problem is who to bring it to. The sheriff is in it." "I know about the sheriff," Jonas said. She looked at him carefully. "How deep does your trail go?" "Deep enough," he said. "The syndicate has men in county government. The sheriff answers to them, and so does the land recorder in Milford. But the federal land office in Cheyenne is outside their reach. If we can get this evidence to the federal marshal's office, and if we go through the right intermediary, someone who isn't compromised—" "Who?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "There's a federal surveyor named Hartley who came through this territory last spring. I've dealt with him before. He's clean, and he has the authority to trigger a federal investigation into fraudulent land claims. If we can document everything you have here against the official survey records he filed, which are held in Cheyenne and which the syndicate cannot touch, we can build an irrefutable case." Maude was quiet for a moment, thinking. "That will take time," she said. "And if anyone in town suspects that something is being built against them, we won't have time." "Agreed," Jonas said. "We work quietly. We don't involve anyone else unless we're certain of them." He paused. "Can you trust your shop to be secure? Is there somewhere safer to keep the primary piece?" "Nobody comes in here," she said, with a dry precision that acknowledged the irony without complaint. "This is probably the safest place in Harrow Creek." Something passed over his face at that, something that might have been anger on her behalf. He looked around the shop at the bundles of fleece, the hanging dye plants, the 2 looms with their current works in progress, the small stove in the corner, and the single lamp in the complete, self-sufficient world she had built inside a building everyone else overlooked. "I'm going to need a reason to be seen coming and going here," he said, without drawing suspicion. "You could buy something," she said. "I'm not leaving you to do this alone," he said, and there was a directness to it that she recognized, because it was the same directness she used herself. The refusal to dress a thing in diplomatic softening when blunt honesty was more useful. "You only just met me," she said. "I know what I'm looking at," he said, and he meant the case. But his eyes stayed on her for a beat longer than the case required, and she felt it, a warmth she did not quite know what to do with, which she filed in the part of her mind where she kept things that required more processing time. They agreed that he would return the following afternoon to begin the process of cross-referencing her woven data against the Federal Survey records he carried in his saddlebag, which were copies he had legally obtained through the Cheyenne Land Office before riding south. He would tell anyone who asked that he was commissioning a trade blanket for his horse. "Nobody will ask," Maude said as he rose to leave. "Then we have nothing to worry about," he said. He was wrong about that. Not dramatically or immediately, but as the following days developed, the kind of wrong that builds, the way pressure builds in a closed system before it finds a crack. The first complication arose from an unlikely source. A woman named Hazel Toomey, who kept a boarding house on the north end of town, and who had the particular social function of a town telegraph, someone through whom all significant information eventually passed, and from whom it was then distributed with high efficiency, noticed that Jonas Calloway had been seen entering Maude Norris's weaving shop on 2 consecutive afternoons. Hazel was not a malicious woman. She was simply a woman who had organized her sense of meaning around the architecture of other people's business, and the sight of an interesting stranger choosing to spend time in the establishment of the town's least socially integrated resident was simply too remarkable not to note. She noted it, as Hazel noted all things, aloud and in company. This reached Ellsworth Boone of the Land Office, who had not previously paid any attention to Maude Norris, by way of the saloon, where Hazel's boarder, a man named Cutter who did unspecified work for the syndicate, overheard and passed it on with the special anxiety of someone whose professional survival depends on noticing anything out of the ordinary. Boone did not act immediately. He was not a man who acted immediately on anything, which was one of the qualities that had made him so effective in the slow, careful execution of the land fraud. He considered. He inquired with his characteristic discretion about Jonas Calloway, and what came back was incomplete but suggestive. A man from Nebraska, some connection to George Calloway's old property, asking around about land records at various points over the previous year. Boone went home that evening and sat at his desk for a long time, doing the arithmetic of risk. Maude, meanwhile, had no knowledge of any of this, but she had her own network of observation, which was the streets and fields she walked regularly, the faces she catalogued, the patterns she tracked the way she tracked patterns in her weaving. She noticed, on the 3rd morning after Jonas began coming to her shop, that Cutter, Boone's man, had changed his daily route to pass by her window twice instead of once. She mentioned it to Jonas when he arrived that afternoon. He was quiet for a moment, standing by the window with his hat in his hand, looking out through the glass at the street, and she watched his face while he thought, the way she always watched faces while they thought, because faces that were thinking unself-consciously told the truth in ways that speech often didn't. "How much longer do you need to finish the documentation cross-reference?" he asked. 2 days, she said. "Maybe 3 to make a second woven copy as backup." "We don't have 3 days, he said, "and we probably don't have 2. "Then we need a different plan," she said, which was not the response of a frightened woman but the response of a practical one. They sat at her work table with the maps and records spread between them, and they planned. What they needed, they agreed, was to get the full package of evidence, the primary woven piece, a written translation of the encoding system, and the corroborating Federal Survey copies, into the hands of the Federal Marshal's office in Cheyenne before Boone could move against either of them. The difficulty was that the fastest route between Harrow Creek and Cheyenne passed through Milford, where the county recorder was syndicate compromised and could not be considered safe. There was a man Jonas knew, a former range detective named Aldous Webb, who had left the detective business with his conscience intact and was now operating a freight business out of Laramie, who could carry sealed documents through the territory without arousing suspicion, and who had, on at least 2 previous occasions, carried materials to the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne. If they could get word to Webb, get him to make a pickup in Harrow Creek under the cover of ordinary freight business, they would have their channel. "Can you reach him?" Maude asked. "Telegraph to Laramie," Jonas said. "If I send it from Milford rather than Harrow Creek, it won't pass through the local office." "That's a 2-hour ride," she said. "Yes," he said, and he was looking at her with the directness that she had come to recognize as simply the way he looked at things he was serious about. "Which means I need to leave tonight, and you need to not tell a living soul where I've gone." "I'm not in the habit of telling people things," she said. He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen him close to a smile, and it changed his face in a way that was difficult to look at for very long without something happening in the vicinity of her chest that she was not ready to address. "I know," he said. "That's why we've gotten this far." He left at nightfall, taking Soot out of the livery stable by the back gate, and heading west through the creek bottom where the willows grew thick enough to conceal a rider, circling wide around the south road to avoid the main track through town. Maude watched him go from the back window of her shop and then turned back to her loom. She worked through the night on the backup copy. It was the most demanding piece she had ever woven. The primary piece had been built slowly over 14 months, its encoding accumulated in layers and double-checked against her records after each session. The backup copy needed to reproduce the same information in compressed form, in a single long night's work, and the difficulty was not the mechanical execution, but the need to maintain absolute accuracy in the encoding while working at speed. Any error in the notation would corrupt the record, and there was no room for corruption. This was, in the most literal sense she had ever experienced, work that lives depended on. She thought, as she worked, about the families. Dora Prentice and her 3 children, who had gone east to live with relatives, and whose land now ran cattle for men in Cheyenne who would never look at it. The Arledge family, who had built a house with their own hands over 3 summers and been driven off with nothing but what they could carry. Thomas Whitmore, an elderly man farming alone, found to have relocated suddenly without telling any of his neighbors, and whom nobody seemed to know the current whereabouts of, which frightened her more than anything else she had uncovered. The thread she was working with was rust and brown and cream, and her fingers moved through it steadily, and the night moved around her like water around a stone. And by the time the sky outside her east-facing window began to lighten from black to the deep gray blue of early dawn, she had finished the backup. She folded it carefully, wrapped it in oilcloth, and placed it in the cavity beneath the false bottom of her cedar chest, which held it alongside the dried plant specimens, dye samples, and pattern records that any random search of her premises would interpret as purely professional materials. Jonas returned the following evening, arriving through the back alley with the look of a man who had covered 40 miles in 24 hours and would not complain about it. "Webb is coming," he said. 3 days. He'll arrive as a regular freight delivery, dry goods to the general store." 3 days, she said. "Can you stay quiet for 3 days?" "I've been quiet for 3 years, she said. "What about you?" "I'll be visible," he said. "Normal, looking at property around town the way a man looking to settle would look." "Giving them nothing," she nodded. Then, because she was who she was, she said, "Are you hungry?" He looked at her with a slight surprise, as though hunger had not occurred to him in some time as a subject worth addressing. "Yes," he said. She made supper on her small stove, salt pork and cornbread, and the last of the dried apples she had from the summer, and they ate at her work table with the backup copy and the Federal Survey papers between them. And she explained more fully the notation system she had used, and he asked good questions, the kind of questions that revealed he had understood most of what she had already said and was building on it rather than catching up, which she appreciated. "The threading sequences in the border," he said, pointing at the backup piece. "These encode the certificate numbers you cross-referenced." "The threading encodes the registration sequence," she said. "The color shifts in each threading block encode the actual certificate numbers. You read them the way you'd read a column of figures, left border top to bottom, then right border bottom to top. And the discrepancy between those numbers and the homestead dates would be apparent to anyone who understood the encoding. Apparent and irrefutable, she said. Because the encoding is derived directly from the public record dates, which are still held in Milford. Anyone with access to those original records can verify my figures independently. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You built this system yourself?" "Yes." "How long did it take you to develop the notation?" She thought about it. "Years," she said honestly. "I started experimenting with information encoding in my weaving when I was about 17. My first serious attempt was a kind of personal diary, encoded in a piece I made for my mother. Nobody who looked at it knew what they were seeing, but I could read it perfectly." She paused. "I refined the system as I went. The land documentation version is the most complex I've made." "It's extraordinary," he said, with the complete simplicity of someone stating a fact. She looked at him. "Most people think it's just a blanket." "Most people," he said, "are not looking at what's actually in front of them." There was a quality to the way he said it, and to the way he was looking at her while he said it, that made her set down her fork very carefully on the edge of the plate and look back at him with an attention that was not entirely professional. "What made you come into my shop that first morning?" she asked. "It was cold," he said, "and your lamp was on. That's all." He considered the question seriously, which was another thing she appreciated about him, the refusal to answer before thinking. "No," he said finally. "I'd noticed you before that, around town. The way you looked at things." He seemed faintly uncomfortable with the admission, not embarrassed by it but uncomfortable in the way of someone unused to saying personal things aloud. "You walked like someone who was reading the town. I recognized it because I do it too." She was quiet for a moment, aware of a warmth that was spreading in her chest with the quiet insistence of a fire that has found dry wood. "I've been careful not to draw attention," she said. "I know," he said. "You were careful. But if you know what to look for, a person who is carefully not drawing attention draws attention of a different kind." She almost smiled. "Is that your excuse for being here?" "I don't need an excuse," he said, and the simplicity of it, the complete lack of qualification or apology, did something to the careful structure of her self-sufficiency that she was going to need to think about at length when she had time. She did not have time. Not then. 3 days felt short when you were working. It felt considerably shorter when you were waiting and watching and listening for the sound of trouble. Trouble came on the second day. It came in the form of Cutter, Boone's man, who walked into her shop in the middle of the afternoon without knocking, which no one had done before, and stood in the middle of her floor looking at everything with the particular thoroughness of someone who has been sent to look. Maude was at the small loom working on a commission piece, an actual commission, a set of curtain panels for the hotel, which she had been doing legitimately alongside her investigative work for 2 months. She looked up at Cutter with the calm of a woman who had spent the last day and a half reminding herself that calm was not merely a temperamental quality but a strategic resource. "Can I help you?" she said. Cutter was a wide man with a yellow-gray beard and eyes that were set too close together for comfort. He was not, she assessed immediately, the intellectual muscle of the syndicate's operation. He was the physical kind. "Just having a look," he said. "Nice work you do." "Thank you," she said, and kept weaving. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the room, hands behind his back, looking at the pieces she had hung for display, stopping at the work table where the commission curtain material was folded and stacked. He picked up the edge of one folded piece. "All your own work?" he asked. "Every thread," she said. He put the fabric down. He looked at the loom she was working on, then at the large floor loom, then at the back room doorway with its hanging curtain of undyed fleece bundles. "Mind if I look in back?" "I mind very much," she said pleasantly, "and I'd ask you to remember that this is a private business establishment." He looked at her. She looked back at him. This was a kind of conversation she understood, the kind that was conducted entirely in the willingness to hold eye contact, and she did not look away. He left. She waited until she was certain he was gone, and then she went to the back room, opened the cedar chest, and confirmed that the backup copy and the oilcloth package were where she had placed them. They were. She returned to her loom and worked for another 2 hours with the steady hands of a woman who understood that the work was the only thing she could currently control, and controlled it absolutely. She told Jonas that evening. He was silent for a moment that had a particular quality of density to it, the silence of a man restraining an immediate impulse toward a physical response to information he did not like. He was looking for something specific, Jonas said. Yes. He didn't find it. He'll come back, Jonas said, or Boone will send someone more capable. Then we need to move faster than they expect us to, she said. He looked at her. Something had shifted in him over the past 2 days, something she could see in the way he looked at her now, different from the first days when the admiration had been mixed with assessment, the slight wariness of someone deciding how much to trust. The wariness was gone. What was there now was something quieter and more certain, the look of a man who has decided something internally and is living with the decision as a settled fact. Webb arrives tomorrow, he said. If we make the handover early before Boone can do anything, we should be clear. And after, she said, after we hand it off, we give Boone and Crane exactly enough to make them panic, he said. Not so much that they run, but enough that they make a move. If they make a move against us while the evidence is already in Webb's hands and heading to Cheyenne, it only adds to the case against them. She thought about this carefully. You want them to expose themselves. I want them to do something visible, he said, something that can't be explained away. And if they do something violent, then we are ready for that, he said, and there was a flatness to his voice on the last sentence that told her exactly how literally he meant it. She looked at him for a long moment. Jonas, she said, and it was the first time she had used his name in the tone of someone talking to a person they were attached to rather than a colleague. I need you to stay alive through this. He went very still. I'm aware, he said carefully, that I have not given you sufficient reason to feel that particular concern. You've given me enough, she said, equally careful. They looked at each other across the work table, across 14 months of her investigation and a year of his, across the full weight of what they were trying to do and everything that stood against it. And the feeling between them was not a new feeling. She recognized it now. It had been building from the second afternoon, from the moment he had looked at her woven map and said, without condescension or condescension's kissing cousin patronization, what else is it? It was a feeling she had not expected and could not have planned for, the particular sensation of being entirely seen by someone who was choosing to look, and of looking back and finding the view equally striking. She reached across the table and picked up one of the small sample cards she used for color testing, a strip of woven cloth about 6 inches long in the amber and dark brown of her current work. She set it on his side of the table. A token, she said, straight-faced, for the man commissioning the trade blanket. He looked at the sample card. He looked at her. And then he did smile, fully and completely, and it was the kind of smile that rearranged her interior landscape the way a spring flood rearranges a creek bed, suddenly and thoroughly and permanently. I'll keep it, he said. The next day, Webb's freight wagon rolled into Harrow Creek at 10 in the morning, pulled by a matching pair of gray mules, and piled with the kind of dry goods and general merchandise that made it immediately unremarkable, the visual equivalent of furniture in a familiar room. Aldous Webb himself was a weathered man of about 50, with the incurious face of someone who had deliberately cultivated incuriosity as a professional tool, and he made his delivery to the general store with perfect boredom, exchanged a few remarks with the store owner about the weather and the road conditions, and then, in what any observer would have read as an afterthought, stepped across to Birch Street and into Maude's shop to ask about getting some woolen goods for his sister in Laramie. The exchange took 8 minutes. Maude showed him 3 pieces. They agreed on a price for the commission curtain material she already had finished. Money changed hands, and the oilcloth package containing the primary woven map, the written notation key, and Jonas's accompanying documentation slipped into the canvas lining of Webb's coat, which had been constructed to receive exactly that kind of material. She watched Webb's wagon leave the north end of town, moving at the comfortable pace of a man with no particular hurry, and felt the evidence she had spent over a year building move away from her and into the world where it could do what it needed to do. It was an extraordinary sensation, equal parts relief and terror, and something that felt dangerously like grief, the way you always feel something leave even when you have chosen to let it go. Jonas had been visible in the street during all of this, looking at a bulletin board outside the land office with the casual interest of a man considering property, perfectly positioned to observe the entire exchange without appearing to observe anything. He came to her shop an hour after Webb's departure and closed the door behind him. "Done," he said. "Done," she agreed. "Now we provoke them," he said. The provocation was Jonas's idea, and she had approved it after careful consideration, because it was not reckless, it was surgical. He went to the land office and asked Ellsworth Boone, with pleasant directness, about available land parcels in the South Creek district, specifically the former Prentice claim and the Arledge property. He cited his interest in settling and his understanding that the parcels had recently changed hands. He used the certificate numbers he had memorized from Maude's notation system. Boone's composure, according to Jonas's account, held for approximately 40 seconds and then cracked in exactly the way that good composure cracks, from the inside, so that the surface still looked intact but something had gone wrong underneath. He told Jonas those parcels were not available for private sale as they were under syndicate development. Jonas thanked him politely and left. Boone was on the street 10 minutes later, walking quickly toward the sheriff's office. Maude watched this from her window, and it was the first time in 2 weeks that she felt the clean, cold edge of genuine fear. Not fear for the evidence, which was rolling toward Laramie in a freight wagon with a man she trusted. Fear for the two of them specifically, who were now the only loose ends remaining in a situation where loose ends had historically been dealt with in ways that were final. She took the backup copy out of the cedar chest and moved it to the one place in Harrow Creek she believed Boone and Crane would not think to look, which was inside one of her working looms, woven directly into the current commission piece as an additional layer underneath the finished fabric. You would have to know it was there to find it, and to find it you would have to know how to look, and no one in Harrow Creek knew how to look except her. Jonas came back in the early afternoon. "They're going to move tonight," he said, reading her face the moment he stepped inside and seeing that she had already been thinking the same thing. "How do you know?" she said. "Because Crane sent both of his deputies out of town on what he called a patrol circuit," Jonas said. "He only does that when he wants the town to be quiet," she nodded. "So we don't wait in the shop." "No," he said, "we don't wait in the shop." They left before dusk, taking only what was essential, the backup copy from inside the loom, her notation key from memory, his gun, and Soot. Maude's mare, a steady-boned chestnut named Cora, was in the same livery stable as Soot, and they saddled her quickly and quietly in the late afternoon shadow of the livery's back wall while the groom was occupied at the front. They rode to the farm of a man named Patrick Greer, a retired schoolteacher who had his own homestead 3 miles northeast of Harrow Creek, and who had been one of the few people in town to treat Maude with consistent respect, partly because he was old enough to have learned that intelligence did not arrange itself according to gender or expectation, and partly because she had once woven him a blanket in exchange for the use of his reference books. And the quality of it had impressed him enough to recalibrate his opinion of her entirely. He let them in without much surprise, as though he had been half expecting that the situation building quietly around the edges of Harrow Creek would eventually arrive at his door, and put coffee on the stove and listened carefully while Jonas explained the broad strokes of what had been happening. "I suspected Boone," Greer said when Jonas had finished. "Didn't know how to prove it and didn't know who was safe to tell." "There wasn't anyone safe to tell," Jonas said. "There is now." If Crane and Boone make a move against us tonight and the evidence is already in Cheyenne, the federal marshal will have grounds to intervene directly. And if they don't make a move, Greer said. Then we wait for the federal response, Jonas said. Either way, the fraud is documented and submitted. It's out of our hands and into the laws. Greer nodded slowly. What do you need from me? A place to wait, Jonas said, and a witness. Crane and Boone went to Maude's shop that evening. She knew because Patrick Greer's farmhouse was 3 miles away, but his hired man, a quiet Scandinavian named Lars who made a habit of taking his evening air in the direction of town, came back at 9 in the evening with the news that the sheriff's office lamp was dark and 2 horses were tied to the post outside the weaving shop on Birch Street. They were there for 40 minutes. She could imagine it precisely. The search of the premises, the finding of nothing where they expected to find something, the escalating certainty that she had already moved the evidence, the calculation of how much damage had already been done and whether it could still be contained. They left. Lars followed at a careful distance, reported back that Crane had gone to the telegraph office, the only office in town that was staffed around the clock. He's contacting Cheyenne, Jonas said, telling the syndicate. Too late, she said. Yes, he said, it is. They spent the night at Greer's farm, Jonas sleeping in the barn on the hay with his coat pulled around him and his gun close, and Maude sleeping in the spare room with the backup copy under her pillow, not because she was afraid of losing it now, but because it was the accumulated weight of 14 months of work, and it deserved to be close until the job was entirely done. She lay awake for part of the night thinking about what came after. After the federal response, after the indictments or whatever form the legal conclusion took, after the evidence had done what it was built to do, and the families who had been displaced had some avenue of redress. What came after all of that, for her specifically, she was less certain of, because her life in Harrow Creek had organized itself entirely around the investigation for so long that she was not sure what remained underneath it. She thought about Jonas. She thought about the way he had looked at her woven map on the first day, with the focused intensity of a man encountering something that demanded full attention. She thought about the small strip of sample cloth she had set on his side of the table, the wordless thing it had said, and the way he had said, "I'll keep it," with a certainty that sounded like something more permanent than a courtesy. In the morning, Jonas brought coffee from Greer's kitchen and came to the door of her room and knocked and passed the cup in when she opened the door, and they stood in the doorway drinking coffee in the pale light of a Wyoming November morning and said nothing for a moment because nothing needed to be said. "It'll take time," he said finally. "The federal response. Weeks probably." "I know," she said. "I'm not leaving," he said. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You said you were passing through," she said. "I was," he said. "I'm revising that." She considered this for a moment with the seriousness she brought to everything. "You'd stay in Harrow Creek." "I'd stay where you are," he said, with the plainness of a man making a statement of fact about his own intentions. No decoration, no qualification, just the thing itself. "If that's in Harrow Creek or somewhere else," she said. "You should know I'm not easy to live with. I work at odd hours. I talk to myself at the loom. I forget to eat when I'm in the middle of a project. I've been sleeping in hostile country for a year," he said. "I think I can manage a weaver who talks to herself." She almost smiled. And then, because she had never been the kind of woman who dressed a thing up when plain speaking was available, she said, "I would like it very much if you stayed." He nodded once, with the gravity of a man who has just received something significant and is holding it carefully. They returned to Harrow Creek mid-morning, which was a calculated choice. The most dangerous period was over. Crane and Boone had gone to the shop, found nothing, and had no legal basis for direct action against either Jonas or Maude without exposing their own position. Whatever they were doing now, they were doing it in the mode of defensive strategy rather than offensive threat, and defensive strategies took time and room and the availability of options. 3 of those options closed within the next 48 hours. First, Webb's freight wagon reached Laramie, and the package was transferred to the Federal Marshal's Courier Service with a cover letter Jonas had composed, and that Maude had reviewed and supplemented with her own signed statement describing the encoding system and its evidentiary basis. Second, a federal surveyor colleague of Hartley's, a man named Peabody who had worked the Wyoming Territory for 8 years and knew every legitimate claim in the South Creek district by memory, confirmed in a telegraph to the marshal's office that the certificate numbers Maude's documentation indicated were fraudulent, did not correspond to any legitimate filing in his records. Third, Ellsworth Boone attempted to quietly alter 3 entries in the land office register and was caught in the act by his own assistant, a young man named Teddy Marsh who had been growing increasingly uneasy about the operation for months and who, when confronted with what Boone was doing, made the decision, with the quiet moral clarity of someone who has been waiting for a moment to act, to lock the office door from the inside and send for the acting county magistrate. The magistrate arrived from Milford 4 days later, accompanied by a deputy from the federal marshal's office, and the investigation that followed was everything Maude's documentation had promised it would be: comprehensive, irrefutable, and rapid once the framework was in place. Ellsworth Boone was arrested on November 14, 1882, 2 weeks after Jonas Calloway had walked in from the cold and sat down on Maude's bench. Aldous Crane was arrested the following day. He had stayed in his office through the magistrate's arrival with the rigid stillness of a man who has decided that if he does not move, the situation will somehow not solidify, and it had solidified around him anyway. The syndicate's Cheyenne principles took considerably longer because the federal investigation that untangled the full extent of the operation was complex and involved the testimony of multiple parties across 3 territories. But it was initiated, formally and with the full weight of federal land law behind it, and it moved as such things move when they have the evidence they need. Maude was called to Milford to testify before the county magistrate in early December, and she brought both woven pieces, the primary and the backup, and spent 2 hours in a formal proceeding explaining, to a room full of men who had never considered that a textile could be a legal document, exactly how her encoding system worked and what it documented. The magistrate, a weathered man named Horace Adler who had been on the frontier long enough to know that extraordinary times produced extraordinary solutions, listened to the full explanation, examined both pieces under strong lamplight with the attention of a man taking the matter seriously, and then said, with the considered formality of a man delivering a verdict, that the evidence as presented was accepted as documentary evidence of fraudulent land certification and would be entered into the formal record. Jonas was in the courtroom. He sat in the back row because the proceeding was not about him, and his role was that of a witness to a chain of evidence transfer, which took about 10 minutes of testimony before Maude's considerably longer accounting. But he was there the entire time, and she knew it the way you know when something significant is behind you, a warmth and steadiness that did not require looking to confirm. Walking out of the courthouse afterward, into a December afternoon that was cold enough to crystallize your breath, she took 1 step down the courthouse stairs and felt his hand at her elbow, not holding her back but steadying, the way you steady someone on uncertain ground. "You were extraordinary in there," he said, and his voice had the same quality as the night he had said you built this system yourself, the quality of genuine and uncomplicated admiration. "I was accurate," she said. "In your case," he said, "those things are the same." She stopped on the courthouse steps and turned to look at him, and the afternoon light was doing something to the planes of his face that made her aware, again, of the depth of the feeling she had been cataloging and filing and carefully not fully acknowledging for the past 3 weeks. It had run out of filing space. It was simply there in full, requiring acknowledgement. "Jonas," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not done saying it." "Say it," he said. I have been alone for a long time, she said, with the directness she brought to everything, looking at him squarely and without apology. I have been content in that, and I would rather be honest with you than careful because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering you. She paused. I love you, not the way someone loves a rescue or a convenience. I love you the way you love something you recognize that you didn't know you were looking for. He was very still on the step beside her, in the cold December air, and then he reached out and took her hand and held it with both of his, which were large and warm and very steady. Maude, he said, I have been looking for something real for a long time. I didn't know what it looked like. And then I walked into your shop and watched you work and I thought, there it is. That's the thing I've been missing. He held her hand a little tighter. I love you, and I plan to tell you so as often as you'll permit me to. She looked at him for a long moment. I'll permit it fairly often, she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, and it was a small gesture, old-fashioned, deliberate, and in the context of the December courthouse steps and the cold air and the full weight of everything they had come through together, it was the most significant thing anyone had ever done. They rode back to Harrow Creek in the late afternoon, side by side on Soot and Cora, and the land around them was brown and silver with winter dormancy, the creek willows bare, and the sky the particular dense gray of a Wyoming winter that was thinking seriously about snow. It snowed that night. She lay awake in her shop on the cot she kept in the back room and listened to it, the silence of snow falling, which was its own kind of sound, and thought about the future with the particular focused attention she brought to new projects, measuring what was there and what was needed, and what could be built from what was available. In the weeks that followed, as the investigation into the syndicate's land fraud proceeded, and the displaced families began the slow process of recovering their claims through the federal land office, Harrow Creek underwent the gradual, uneven change of a community absorbing new information about itself. There were people who had known something was wrong and were relieved to see it addressed. There were people who had not known and were shaken by the discovery. There were, inevitably, people who had preferred not to know and were now confronted with the fact of it, which required a different kind of reckoning. The Prentice family returned in late January, Dora and her 3 children driving back up the South Road in a wagon loaded with their belongings, their land claim restored by federal order. Dora came to Maude's shop on her second day back, while the children waited outside in the winter cold, and she stood in the doorway looking at Maude with an expression that compressed a great deal of complicated feeling into a single unsteady moment. I heard, Dora said, what you did, how long you'd been at it. 14 months, Maude said. Nobody told me you were working on this. I couldn't tell anyone, Maude said. I was sorry for that. Dora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you wove it, you actually wove the evidence, into a blanket. Into several pieces, Maude said. Dora shook her head slowly. I've walked past this shop more times than I can count, she said, and I never once thought to come in. Nobody did, Maude said without heat. That turned out to be useful. Dora laughed suddenly, the kind of laugh that is released tension more than humor, and then she said, I brought you something. It's wool from our own sheep. It's not much, but it's ours. She held up a flour sack that proved, when Maude accepted it, to contain about 4 pounds of raw fleece, cream-colored and clean, smelling of lanolin and cold air. It was the most valuable material Maude had ever received. Jonas had, by this point, taken up lodgings in the boarding house and was in the process of looking at property east of town, a stretch of bottomland that the syndicate's dissolution had released back into the public domain, and that was available for homestead claim. It was good land, he had told her, well-watered, with enough grass for cattle and a creekside exposure that was sheltered from the worst of the winter wind. He had told her about the land at her work table, over supper, which had become a regular occurrence in the weeks since their courthouse conversation, and she had listened and asked questions about the soil and the water and the exposure, and he had answered each question with the attentiveness of a man who has understood that the person asking is doing real analysis. not making conversation. And then he had said, with the directness that was becoming as familiar to her as the sound of her own loom, "I want you to come see it." She had gone. They had ridden out on a gray February morning with their breath making small clouds in the cold, and she had walked the land with him in the quiet way of people who can share a landscape without filling it with words, and she had seen what he saw, the good winter-brown grass and the creek running clear under a thin skim of ice and the cottonwood trees along the east slope that would be extraordinary in summer. "It's a good claim," she said. "I think so," he said. "I'd need to put up a proper structure. There's a foundation from a previous attempt, the people who were pushed off by the syndicate, which I intend to pay for the right to use." "That's right," she said. He turned to look at her. They were standing in the middle of the field with the cottonwoods behind them and the creek visible as a silver line to the east, and the cold was sharp and clean on her face, and he looked at her with an expression she had catalogued thoroughly by now and could read with complete accuracy. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "I'm doing it here because I want you to see what I'm asking you to share, not just to hear the asking." She looked at the land and then back at him. "That is a very thoughtful approach," she said. "I've been planning it for 2 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. "You've been unusually quiet at supper." He stared at her. "You knew I was planning something." "I suspected," she said. "I wasn't certain until this morning when you suggested we bring a lunch." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he began to laugh, which was a rare and wonderful thing, full and unguarded, the laugh of a man who has encountered something that genuinely surprises and delights him. "Will you?" he said. "Yes," she said, simply and completely. They were married in March, in Patrick Greer's parlor, which was the most comfortable room in the vicinity of Harrow Creek, and was lent with the old schoolteacher's characteristic generosity. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher who came through every 6 weeks, and the witnesses were Patrick Greer himself, Dora Prentice, Teddy Marsh, who had locked Boone into the land office, and whose quiet act of moral courage Maude had been wanting to properly acknowledge, and Lars, the Norwegian hired man, who wept through the ceremony with the unself-conscious emotionality of a man for whom sentiment was simply part of the landscape. Maude wore a dress of her own weaving in a deep copper brown that made her amber eyes look startling, and Jonas wore his best coat and had his hair cut, and they stood in front of the preacher and said the words with the complete seriousness of 2 people who understood exactly what they were promising and to whom. She moved into the boarding house while the property east of town was prepared. Jonas had hired 2 local men to help with the construction, and work began as soon as the March ground thawed enough to dig. By April, there was a foundation and a frame. By May, there were walls and a roof. By June, the house was livable, tight-built and practical, with a room on the west end that caught the afternoon light in a way that Jonas had planned specifically, because it was the room he had intended from the beginning for her looms. She stood in that room on the first day in the new house, with the afternoon light coming in broad and warm across the floorboards, and her 2 looms set up and dressed and ready, and the cedar chest in the corner, and bundles of summer-harvested dye plants hanging from the ceiling beams where she had attached hooks in the same configuration as the shop on Birch Street, and she felt something settle inside her that she had not known was unsettled. Jonas came to the doorway and leaned against the frame, watching her standing in the light. "Is it right?" he said. "It's perfect," she said. She wove through the summer and autumn of 1883 with a productivity that she attributed partly to the quality of the light in the new room and partly to the particular fertility of contentment, which was a condition she had been intellectually aware of without fully experiencing, and which turned out to be even better in practice than in theory. She produced more work, better work, work that had a quality she could not have precisely named, but that her customers felt without being able to name it either. She sold 4 pieces to the hotel in Milford. She took a commission from the county courthouse, which wanted a ceremonial hanging piece for their new courtroom, and she wove into it, because she could not resist, and because it was entirely appropriate, and because no one would know unless she told them, a small embedded section in the border that encoded the date of Boone's arrest and the case number of the federal land fraud investigation. She told Jonas about this one evening in the summer, sitting on the porch they had built along the south wall of the house that looked out toward the creek. The evening was warm and the cottonwoods were full, and she was spinning on a drop spindle while he cleaned his bridle, a domestic scene of almost ostentatious normalcy, and she told him about the courthouse piece, and he stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "You put the case number in the courthouse weaving," he said. "In the left border," she said, "in a modified version of the secondary notation system." He was quiet for a moment. "That's going to hang in the county courthouse." "Yes," she said. "For potentially decades." "Probably," she said. He looked at her. Then he said, "That is the best thing I have ever heard." She smiled and kept spinning. The federal case against the Cheyenne Syndicate concluded in the spring of 1884, 18 months after Maude's woven documentation had been delivered to the marshal's office. The conclusion was not dramatic, no shootout or single climactic confrontation, but a careful legal accounting that resulted in the indictment of 11 individuals, including 3 men in the territorial government, who had facilitated the fraudulent certification process, and the restoration of land claims to 7 of the 9 displaced families Maude had documented. The 2 remaining families received financial compensation from the seized assets of the syndicate, which was not the same as having their land returned, but was something. Thomas Whitmore, the elderly man whose sudden disappearance had frightened her most, was found in the course of the investigation to have been relocated under duress to Colorado, where he had been quietly set up with a small annuity by the syndicate as part of an agreement not to speak about what had happened to his property. He was alive and old, and when the federal investigators reached him, he was both frightened and quietly furious, and his testimony, added to the accumulated weight of everything else, was the piece that finally connected the syndicate's Cheyenne principles directly to the physical intimidation of homesteaders rather than merely the paper fraud. Maude learned about Whitmore's testimony from a letter Jonas received from the federal marshal's deputy, and she read it at the kitchen table in the early morning while Jonas was out at the barn, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized she had been carrying tight since the winter of 1881, when she had first noticed his name missing from the record and begun to fear the worst. He was alive. He was angry. He was being heard. She set the letter down and sat for a moment in the morning quiet of her kitchen, and then she went to the loom room and began a new piece, working fast and with clear intention, a small personal piece not for commission or sale, woven in the old woman's colors, cream and rust and deep green, in a threading pattern that encoded in her private notation the names of all 9 families she had documented and the resolution of each case and the date. It was, she thought, a record worth keeping. Their son was born in the autumn of 1884 in the new house, with the assistance of the Harrow Creek midwife and the frantic pacing of Jonas Calloway outside the bedroom door, which Maude was aware of even through the labor, and which she found both touching and somewhat amusing. The boy was born healthy and loud and very red in the face, with dark hair that Jonas had obviously contributed, and they named him George Thomas Calloway, for Jonas's father and for Thomas Whitmore, which seemed right on both counts. George Thomas Calloway was 6 months old when he attended his first county courthouse session, being carried in a wool sling of his mother's making while she gave the final deposited testimony in the land fraud case and watched the last of the official proceedings close. He slept through the whole thing, which she felt was appropriate, because he had the particular gift of the very young for finding any place his mother was likely to be deeply comfortable. The Harrow Creek that Maude Norris had arrived in during the spring of 1879 was not exactly the same as the one she lived in by 1885. Towns change as people change, not in their fundamental nature but in their arrangement of things, in the distribution of their understanding. There were people in town who now came to her shop, which she had kept, using it as her business premises while maintaining the family home on the eastern bottomland, with the directness of people who have been made aware of their own previous inattention and are managing it with the pragmatic forward momentum of the frontier. You acknowledge the past error and you change the behavior. There were women who brought their children to look at the looms. There were men who commissioned work without the old nervousness, the discomfort that had been partly about a capable woman operating alone, and partly about their own dim recognition that she was seeing more than she was letting on. There was Dora Prentice, who had taken up spinning herself and brought her raw fiber to Maude for opinion and advice, with the easy camaraderie of women who have shared something significant and come through it together. Hazel Toomey, who had been the vector of the gossip that had first alerted Cutter to Jonas's visits, came to the shop one afternoon in the spring of 1885 with what Maude recognized, through long practice, as a complex mixture of guilt and the desire to discharge it, and she sat on the bench and said, without particular preamble, "I don't know if my talking was part of what put you in danger." "It may have been," Maude said from the loom, not unkindly. "But it also pushed things to a conclusion faster than they might otherwise have reached." Hazel considered this. "You're not angry." "I was," Maude said honestly, "for a little while. But you didn't know what you were doing and the outcome was what it needed to be." She looked up from the loom. "I'd rather you knew now that the things we say, even without malice, have directions we can't fully see." Hazel nodded slowly. "That's a generous way to put it." "It's an accurate way," Maude said, and returned to her work. By the time George Thomas was old enough to be interested in things, he was interested in everything, with the all-consuming and slightly exhausting curiosity of a child who has inherited a great deal of cognitive energy from both parents. He liked the barn and the horses and the creek and the weaving room in approximately equal measure, and he had from an early age the habit of sitting near his mother's loom and asking questions while she worked. "What does it say?" he asked, when he was old enough to understand that the weaving could mean things beyond its surface. "Ask me specifically," she said. He pointed at the border of a piece she was working on. "That part. That part records the date this piece was started," she said, "and the name of the person who commissioned it. And in the very small section there at the corner, there's a note that says your father fixed the east fence that morning because one of the calves had gotten through." George Thomas stared at the weaving. "You put the calf in there." "I put the calf in there," she said. He looked at it for another long moment, with an expression she recognized because she had seen it on Jonas's face on that first afternoon, the expression of encountering something whose depth had not been immediately apparent and adjusting for it. "Will you teach me?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "when your hands are big enough for the loom." Jonas had built his cattle operation carefully and competently, which was the only way he did anything, and by 1886 the Calloway bottomland was running a respectable herd on the good grass and producing calves that sold well at the territorial market. He had hired one man permanently, a Texan named Harper who was quiet and excellent with horses, and in busy seasons he took on day labor from the town without difficulty, because his reputation as a fair employer had established itself through the simple, reliable method of actually being fair. He came home in the evenings to supper and to the sound of the loom and to Maude's particular quality of presence, which had not changed from the woman who had told him to shut the door or sit down, and had meant both options equally. She was still direct, still unsentimental in the everyday way of practical people, while being deeply and continuously affectionate in the way that counted. She still talked to herself at the loom. She still forgot to eat when she was deep in a project, which he had addressed by the simple strategy of bringing her food without asking. She still registered everything. Watching her in any company, he sometimes thought about what it would have been like to be on the wrong side of that particular mind, and he felt a secondary appreciation for having been so thoroughly on the right side of it. Their second child, a daughter they named Amma, after the Shoshone woman who had taught Maude her dye knowledge years before in Utah, arrived in the summer of 1887. She was born with copper-dark hair that was all Maude, and Jonas's square jaw softened into something considerably more pleasant, and she cried with a directness and volume that her father found deeply familiar. The autumn of 1887 was when the large piece came together. Maude had been planning it for 2 years, working on the threading draft in her notebook and making small test samples in her dye palette, and returning to it repeatedly between commissions and personal pieces. And when she finally set up the warp and began to weave, the house settled into the particular quality of quiet that Jonas and George Thomas had learned to recognize as the sign that something significant was in progress and that meals would be irregular for the duration. The piece took 3 months. It was large enough to cover the full wall of a room, woven in the full range of her dye palette, which by 1887 included 47 distinct colors derived from plants, minerals, and insects she had sourced over years of systematic effort. Its surface pattern was abstract, deeply structured, beautiful in the way of things that are built from internal logic made visible. And inside it, in the full complexity of her notation system, was the complete documented history of the Harrow Creek land fraud. The names of every family, the certificate numbers, the dates, the fraud and the resolution and the testimony and the federal case conclusion. Every displaced family and every restoration. Thomas Whitmore's name and his survival. George Calloway's name and the land that had been taken from him. It was a memorial and a record and an act of witnessing, all woven into a single cloth. She gave it to the Harrow Creek courthouse. Not the county courthouse in Milford, but the small local justice facility that had been established in Harrow Creek proper in 1885 as the town grew and the county recognized the need for local adjudication. It hung there on the east wall of the main room for decades, admired by everyone who entered and understood by none of them as anything more than a remarkable piece of frontier textile art, which was, Maude thought, exactly as it should be. The information was there. The truth was there, woven into the cloth and permanent, surviving any attempt to revise or obscure or forget. It would outlast her and outlast the people who had caused the harm and the people who had repaired it, and it would continue to hold the record in the way that only the most durable things can hold a record, not in paper that burns or ink that fades, but in structure itself, in the interlacement of fiber that gives cloth its fundamental integrity. In the spring of 1888, a letter arrived from the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne, addressed to Maude Norris Calloway, informing her that her woven documentation had been formally recognized as an admissible evidentiary record in the concluded case of the United States federal government against the Cheyenne Cattlemen's Syndicate and its associated principals, and that her contribution to the investigation had been noted in the official record of the proceedings. She read the letter at the kitchen table, with George Thomas playing on the floor nearby and little Amma asleep in the wooden cradle Jonas had made the previous winter from cottonwood he had cut himself, and she folded the letter carefully and set it on top of the cedar chest, which was in the kitchen now because the loom room had been extended and the chest had been moved to make space. Jonas came in from the barn while she was sitting there, smelling of horse and cold and the particular clean outdoor scent that she associated entirely with him, and he looked at the letter and then at her. "Good news," he said. "Official acknowledgement," she said. He picked up the letter and read it. When he set it down, he looked at her with the expression she knew best, the one that was all of it together, admiration and warmth and something that had only grown deeper and more settled over the years, the look of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was missing and knows he has found it. "They called your work remarkable," he said. "They called it admissible," she corrected, "which is the part that matters." He came around the table and bent down and kissed her, unhurried and thorough, the kind of kiss that belongs to people who have enough time and know it. George Thomas made a sound of 4-year-old protest from the floor. They separated, laughing quietly. Jonas pulled a chair up close to hers and sat beside her with his shoulder against hers, looking at the letter and the cedar chest and the long light of spring coming in through the window. "What are you going to work on next?" he said. She considered. "I have a commission from the hotel in Casper," she said. "A large piece for their lobby." She paused. "And I've been thinking about a series, personal pieces not commissioned, about the land." She looked at the window, at the creek visible in the distance, silver and steady. "There are stories in this territory that haven't been held anywhere yet, that aren't in any record that will survive. You're going to weave them," he said. "Someone has to," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the ease of long habit and deep trust, and outside the window the spring land of the Wyoming Territory spread out in its immensity, grassland and creek bottom and the enormous sky, full of the stories of every person who had ever tried to make something real and lasting in it. And inside the house the loom waited in the west room, dressed and ready, in the afternoon light. Little Amma woke up. Her cry was small and vigorous, and immediately demanding. Maude rose, and Jonas rose with her, and they went to their daughter together. And the March light came through the windows onto the wooden floor and the cedar chest and the folded federal letter, and all the ordinary remarkable details of a life that had been built from honesty and work and the willingness to look directly at hard things and hold them in the light until they could be seen for what they were. And on the wall of the courthouse in Harrow Creek, the great woven piece hung in its rich complexity, its surface beautiful and its hidden depths immeasurable, holding everything that had happened in the precise and patient record of its threads, the way the land itself holds what happens on it, in the deep, slow memory of things made to last. Maude Norris had been the weaver nobody noticed, in the shop nobody entered, doing work that nobody thought to look at closely enough to read. She had unraveled the fraud thread by thread. She had done it alone for 14 months, and then with the man she loved for 3 weeks. And between the two of them, they had held a mirror up to Harrow Creek until the town could no longer avoid seeing what was in it. And what came after was this: a house on good bottom land, a husband who saw her completely and loved what he saw, a son who was going to have a mind like a compass and hands that would learn the loom before his 10th birthday, a daughter who cried with the directness of someone who already knew what she needed, dye plants hanging from the ceiling beams, and the loom dressed with the next piece, and the one after that, and all the ones that would come after those, accumulating the story of a territory and a time in the only language she had ever fully trusted, thread by thread by thread.